Sometimes the heart learns to beat again when you least expect it. Eleanor Whitmore had spent 20 years believing her capacity for love died with her husband, until she met the vampire lord who would change everything. At 57, she arrives at the ancient stone keep of Ravenshollow on a desperate diplomatic mission. The realm teeters on the edge of war, and she is their last hope for peace with the mysterious Lord Lucien Ashford. What begins as cold negotiation becomes something far more dangerous when Eleanor discovers that the vampire lord carries the same quiet loneliness she has harbored for decades. When Lucien looks into her eyes and speaks those haunting words, Eleanor faces an impossible choice. She can return to her empty manor and live out her remaining years in solitude, or she can accept his dark gift and embrace a love that will last forever. But is she brave enough to trust her heart one more time? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silver signet ring felt heavier on Eleanor's finger as her carriage lurched through another pothole on the ancient road to Ravenshollow. She twisted the tarnished band, her late husband's family seal, and watched the autumn countryside roll past through rain-streaked windows. 20 years had passed since Thomas died, and still she wore his ring alongside her simple wedding band, unable to let go of the weight of his memory or the responsibility it represented. Eleanor Whitmore had married at 17, full of dreams and romantic notions that seemed laughable now. Thomas had been 10 years her senior, kind but distant, a man who saw marriage as a political alliance rather than a love match. She had learned to find contentment in managing his estates, raising their 3 children, and playing the role of the perfect noble wife. When fever took him at 47, leaving her a widow at 37, she had expected grief to consume her. Instead, she found something unexpected: relief. The relief had been followed immediately by guilt, then by the crushing reality of her situation. Thomas's brother inherited the title and primary estates, leaving Eleanor with a modest dower property and 3 children who seemed to view her as an obligation rather than a mother. William, now 35, and married to a woman who barely tolerated Eleanor's presence, managed the family's political interests with cold efficiency. Margaret had wed a lord in a neighbouring realm and visited perhaps twice a year, always with criticism about Eleanor's choices. James, the youngest at 28, showed the most affection but was perpetually short of funds and treated his mother's home as a convenient retreat between his gambling debts. The realm of Astoria had been sliding toward war for the better part of a decade, what had begun as border. Skirmishes between neighboring kingdoms had escalated into a complex web of alliances and betrayals. The great houses chose sides based on old grudges and perceived advantages, while common folk suffered the consequences of burned fields and stolen livestock. Eleanor's own land sat uncomfortably close to the contested borders, making her position even more precarious. When the royal council summoned her to court 3 weeks ago, she had assumed they wanted to discuss taxation or grain supplies for the army. Instead, she found herself facing a room full of men who looked at her with the calculating expressions of those who had found a useful tool. Lady Whitmore, Lord Chancellor Aldrich had announced, his voice carrying the authority of King Edward's absent presence, "The crown has need of your diplomatic skills." Eleanor had almost laughed at the presumption. Her diplomatic skills consisted of managing household staff and mediating disputes between tenant farmers. But as Aldrich explained the situation, she began to understand why they had chosen her specifically. Lord Lucien Ashford controlled the mountain passes that armies would need to reach the kingdom's heart. He commanded the loyalty of several smaller lords and maintained a fortress that had never been successfully besieged. More importantly, he was rumored to be something far more dangerous than a mere mortal lord. Whispers spoke of vampiric powers and an unnaturally long life. The council needed his neutrality, if not his active support, and every ambassador they had sent had either been turned away at the gates or simply disappeared. Why me? Eleanor had asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "You are a widow of good standing but limited political importance," Aldrich had replied with brutal honesty. "Lord Ashford may be more receptive to negotiating with someone who poses no threat, and if you should fail to return—" He had not needed to finish. Eleanor was expendable. Her children had already inherited what they would receive from her estate. Her death might even be convenient, removing their obligation to support an aging mother. The journey to Ravenshollow had taken 5 days through increasingly wild country. Her escort of 6 soldiers had grown more nervous with each mile, muttering prayers and checking their weapons. The local villagers they encountered spoke of Lord Ashford with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. He protected them from bandits and enemy raids, but the price of his protection was never questioned too closely. Eleanor found herself oddly calm as they travelled deeper into his territory. Perhaps it was the acceptance that comes with age, or perhaps the knowledge that she had little left to lose. Her children would mourn her briefly and then get on with their lives. The servants at her manor would find new positions. The world would continue without Eleanor Whitmore, just as it had continued without her husband. The first glimpse of Ravenshollow Keep took her breath away. The fortress rose from a craggy hilltop like something from a fairy tale, all soaring towers and weathered stone. Ancient battlements caught the late afternoon light, and Eleanor could see the dark shapes of ravens circling the highest tower, hence the name, she supposed. The keep was older than any structure she had ever seen, its architecture speaking of centuries of careful maintenance and gradual expansion. There was something both beautiful and ominous about the way it dominated the landscape. As their carriage wound up the steep path to the gates, Eleanor noticed signs of prosperity that seemed at odds with the war-torn countryside they had travelled through. The fields were well tended, the livestock healthy and numerous. The peasants they passed looked well-fed and clean, and more than one stopped their work to bow respectfully as the carriage passed. Whatever else Lord Ashford might be, he appeared to take care of his people. The gates of Ravenshollow stood open, flanked by guards who wore no visible armour, yet moved with a predatory grace that made Eleanor's escort shift nervously in their saddles. These were not ordinary men. Something about their pale skin and 2 bright eyes suggested the whispered rumours about their lord might have more truth than the council suspected. Lady Whitmore, one of them spoke, his voice carrying clearly despite the distance. "Lord Ashford awaits your pleasure in the main hall." Eleanor's soldiers exchanged glances. They had been prepared to demand entrance or lay siege if necessary, not to be welcomed like honoured guests. As Eleanor stepped down from her carriage, she felt a strange sense of inevitability settle over her. Whatever happened in this place would change her life irrevocably, she was certain of it. The courtyard was immaculate, with carved stone fountains and carefully maintained gardens that seemed to flourish despite the season. Servants appeared to take her bags, moving with the same fluid grace as the guards. Eleanor noticed that many of them were beautiful in an almost unearthly way, with pale skin and dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of experience no mortal should possess. "Your men may stable their horses and find refreshment in the garrison," the guard captain informed Eleanor's escort. "Lady Whitmore, if you would follow me." Eleanor squared her shoulders and walked toward the keep's main entrance. The massive oak doors stood open, revealing a great hall that took her breath away. Tapestries depicting scenes of ancient battles and mythical beasts hung from stone walls, while overhead an intricate vaulted ceiling disappeared into shadows. The late afternoon light streaming through tall windows illuminated a space that managed to be both grand and oddly intimate. And there, standing before a massive fireplace at the far end of the hall, was the man she had come to negotiate with. Lord Lucien Ashford was not what she had expected. The council's briefings had described him as ageless and dangerous, but they had failed to mention the quiet dignity in his bearing or the way he seemed to carry some invisible weight. He appeared to be perhaps 40 years old, with dark hair touched by silver at the temples and grey eyes that held the kind of weariness that came only from having seen too much. He was tall and lean, dressed simply in dark clothing that spoke of quality without ostentation. When their eyes met across the length of the hall, Eleanor felt something unexpected stir in her chest, a flutter of awareness she had not experienced in decades. It was quickly followed by practical caution. This man was potentially her enemy, certainly her diplomatic challenge, and possibly something far more dangerous than either. She could not afford to be distracted by an aging woman's foolish reaction to an attractive man. "Lady Whitmore," he said, inclining his head in a gesture that was respectful, without being subservient. His voice was rich and cultured, with just a hint of an accent she could not place. "Welcome to Ravenshollow. I trust your journey was not too arduous." "Lord Ashford," she replied, offering a curtsy that acknowledged his rank while maintaining her own dignity. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. His Majesty's Council sends their greetings and hopes that we might find common ground for discussion." Something flickered in those grey eyes. Amusement, perhaps, or recognition of the diplomatic formulae they were both required to observe. "Indeed," he said, "common ground can be surprisingly difficult to find in these troubled times. Shall we retire to my study? I believe we will be more comfortable there than in this draughty hall." As he gestured for her to precede him toward a side corridor, Eleanor caught sight of something that made her pause. Along the walls of the hall hung portraits, dozens of them, depicting men, women, and children in clothing that spanned centuries of fashion. But what struck her was not their number, but the expression she could see in each painted face. Every subject looked directly at the viewer, with eyes that held the same deep sadness she had glimpsed in Lord Ashford's gaze. "My family," he said quietly, noticing her attention. "Those who came before, they all share a certain gravity of expression," Eleanor observed carefully. "Loss has a way of marking us," he replied. "Perhaps that is something you understand, Lady Whitmore." The simple observation hit closer to home than she had expected. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized this stranger had seen something in her face that she thought she had learned to hide. Before she could formulate a response, he was already leading her toward his study, leaving her to wonder what else those perceptive grey eyes might have discerned during their brief encounter. As they walked through corridors lined with ancient tapestries and lit by candles that burned with unusual steadiness, Eleanor began to understand that her mission to Ravenshollow would be far more complex than anyone had anticipated. Lord Lucien Ashford was not simply a political obstacle to be maneuvered around. He was a man who carried his own deep currents of experience and emotion. And despite every rational objection her mind could muster, Eleanor found herself curious to discover what lay beneath the surface of his carefully controlled exterior. The stone walls of Ravenshollow seemed to hold centuries of secrets, and Eleanor Whitmore, who had spent 20 years believing her own story was finished, suddenly wondered if she might be about to discover an entirely new chapter. Lucien's study was a sanctuary of warm light and carefully ordered knowledge. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined 3 walls, filled with volumes that looked as though they had been collected across centuries. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across Persian rugs and comfortable leather chairs. Eleanor settled into the seat he offered, noting how the lamplight seemed to soften the harsh angles of his face without diminishing the intensity of his gaze. "Wine? Wine?" he asked, moving to a sideboard laden with crystal decanters. "I have an excellent vintage from the southern provinces." "Thank you," Eleanor replied, watching his movements with professional attention. Everything about Lord Ashford spoke of cultivation and restraint, from his precise gestures to the way he seemed to consider each word before speaking. This was not a man given to impulsive decisions which might work in her favor during negotiations. He handed her a glass of deep red wine and settled into the chair across from her, close enough for conversation but maintaining a respectful distance. The wine was indeed excellent, with a richness that spoke of careful aging and considerable expense. Eleanor took a small sip and set the glass aside. focusing her attention on the man who held her mission's success in his hands. "The council's terms are straightforward," she began, reaching into her traveling case for the sealed documents. "His Majesty seeks assurance of your neutrality in the current conflict. In return, he offers formal recognition of your sovereignty over these lands and preferential trade agreements once hostilities cease." Lucien accepted the documents, but did not immediately open them. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and studied Eleanor with those disconcerting grey eyes. "Tell me, Lady Whitmore," he said quietly, "what do you know of my reputation?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. Eleanor had expected diplomatic dance, not immediate confrontation of the rumors that surrounded him. "I know that some say you are older than you appear," she replied carefully, "that your family has held these lands for longer than records show, that your protection of the local people has been unusually effective. And what do you believe?" Eleanor considered her words. "I believe that power takes many forms, and that wisdom often comes from experience others cannot imagine. Beyond that, I prefer to judge men by their actions rather than village gossip." A smile touched the corners of his mouth, the first genuinely warm expression she had seen from him. A diplomatic answer, yet honest. "I appreciate both qualities." He rose from his chair and moved toward one of the study's walls, where Eleanor now noticed a gap in the bookshelves. With a gentle touch, a hidden panel swung open, revealing a corridor beyond. "There is something I would like to show you," he said, "if you are willing to trust me that far." Every instinct Eleanor had developed during decades of political maneuvering warned her against following a man she barely knew into hidden passages. Yet something in his manner, a vulnerability she had not expected, made her curious enough to set aside caution. "Very well," she said, rising and smoothing her skirts. "Lead on, Lord Ashford." The corridor beyond was narrow and clearly ancient, lit by torches that burned with the same steady light she had noticed throughout the keep. Their footsteps echoed softly on worn stone as Lucien led her deeper into the heart of Ravenshollow. Eleanor found herself wondering how many others had walked this path before her, and whether any of them had emerged unchanged. They stopped before heavy wooden doors carved with symbols Eleanor did not recognize. Lucien paused with his hand on the iron handle, turning to meet her eyes in the flickering torchlight. "What lies beyond this door may alter your understanding of our negotiations," he said seriously. "You may leave now with your diplomatic mission intact, or you may enter and discover truths that will complicate everything you thought you knew. The choice is yours." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. She had spent 20 years choosing safety over uncertainty, known comfort over potential discovery. The woman who had buried her dreams with her husband would have turned back immediately. But standing in that shadowed corridor, facing a man whose eyes held depths she longed to explore, Eleanor found herself reaching for something she had thought lost forever: courage. "Open the door," she said. The chamber beyond took her breath away. It was circular, with a domed ceiling painted with constellations that seemed to move in the lamplight. But what captured her attention immediately were the portraits, dozens of them, covering every available wall space. Men, women, children, all painted with extraordinary skill and obvious care. Unlike the formal family portraits in the Great Hall, these were intimate, capturing moments of joy, contemplation, or quiet sorrow. "My family," Lucien said quietly, moving to stand before a portrait of a woman with kind eyes and greying hair. "My mortal family." Eleanor stepped closer, studying the paintings with growing amazement. The clothing styles spanned centuries: medieval robes, Renaissance finery, clothing from her grandmother's era. Yet every face bore some resemblance to the man standing beside her. "How is this possible?" she whispered. "I was born in the year 1247, Lucien said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the revelation. "I have watched empires rise and fall, seen plagues ravage continents and peace return. I have loved and lost more than any man should endure, and yet I continue. Eleanor's mind reeled as she absorbed the implications. The rumors had spoken of unusual longevity, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. She was standing beside a man who had lived through 7 centuries, who had watched everyone he cared about age and die while he remained unchanged. "The woman in this portrait," she said, approaching a painting that showed particular care in its execution, "she meant something special to you." "My wife," he said softly, "Isabel. I was 28 when I married her, thought myself a man who understood love. She gave me 30 years of happiness before fever claimed her. I was, not as I am now, then. Still mortal, still innocent of what I would become." Eleanor found herself drawn to the portrait of Isabel, seeing in the painted features the same gentle strength she recognized in her own mirror. Here was a woman who had loved and been loved, who had faced life's challenges with quiet dignity. In the artist's careful brushstrokes, Eleanor could see the depth of Lucien's devotion to her memory. "How did you become?" she began, then stopped, uncertain how to phrase such an impossible question. "A vampire," he supplied gently. "The transformation came later, born from grief and a bargain I thought I understood. Isabel had been dead 10 years, and I was still a broken man, living more in memory than in the present. When the opportunity arose to ensure I would never lose anyone again to time's passage, I thought I was choosing strength. Instead, you chose a different kind of loss," Eleanor said, understanding flooding through her. "You chose to watch everyone you came to care about slip away while you remained." Lucien turned to look at her, surprise clear in his expression. "Yes," he said simply, "that is exactly what I chose, though I did not understand it then." Eleanor moved slowly through the gallery, studying each face and reading the love that had preserved their memory in pigment and canvas. These were not just portraits, they were shrines to connection, testament to a man who had found the courage to love again and again, despite knowing how each story would end. "The children," she said, pausing before a portrait of twin boys with Lucien's grey eyes. "They were yours?" "Isabel's sons, from her first marriage. I raised them, watched them grow into fine men, held their hands as they died in their beds, surrounded by grandchildren I would outlive by centuries." His voice carried the weight of accumulated sorrow, yet also a kind of fierce protectiveness. "Every face you see here represents a choice to remain present in life rather than retreat into isolation." Eleanor understood then why he had shown her this place. The diplomatic mission she had come to complete was insignificant compared to the larger question of connection and courage. Lord Lucien Ashford was not simply a political ally to be courted. He was a man who had found ways to love despite unimaginable loss, who had chosen vulnerability over safety again and again. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Lucien moved to stand before her, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the careful control that kept deeper emotions in check. "Because, Lady Eleanor Whitmore," he said, using her given name for the first time, "you carry the same weariness I recognize in myself. You have learned to live with loss, to find purpose in duty rather than joy. And because from the moment you walked into my hall, I have seen in your eyes the first stirring of something I thought I had forgotten how to feel." The chamber seemed to hold its breath around them. Eleanor felt the careful walls she had built around her heart, trembling under the weight of recognition. Here was a man who understood the price of surviving when those you love do not, who had found the courage to risk his heart despite knowing the cost. "What are you asking of me?" she whispered. "Nothing," he replied. "Everything. The choice to see where courage might lead us both." Eleanor stood, surrounded by the faces of the beloved dead, feeling the pull of possibility for the first time in 20 years. The diplomatic mission that had brought her to Ravenshollow suddenly seemed like merely the excuse that fate had needed to bring her to this moment, this man, this impossible choice between safety and the terrifying promise of new love. Eleanor's chambers were far more luxurious than she had expected, with tapestries depicting pastoral scenes and windows that overlooked the keep's gardens. A fire burned cheerfully in the hearth, and her belongings had been arranged with careful attention to her comfort. Yet, as she sat at the writing desk in her nightgown, she found it impossible to focus on anything but the impossible conversation that had taken place hours earlier. Her travel journal lay open before her, the familiar leather binding worn smooth by years of recording thoughts she dared not speak aloud. Tonight, her usually neat handwriting appeared shaky as she struggled to process what Lucien had revealed. "He claims to be over 6 centuries old," she wrote. "The portrait suggests this impossible claim may be true. More disturbing still is my own reaction, not the terror any sensible woman should feel, but fascination. Am I so desperate for connection that I would entertain the attentions of something that should not exist?" She set down her pen and moved to the window, looking out over moonlit gardens that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Somewhere in this ancient keep was a man who had loved and lost across centuries, who looked at her with recognition that went deeper than mere attraction. The diplomatic mission that had brought her here now seemed like a convenient fiction. She was no longer certain whether the Crown's interests or her own inexplicable draw to Lucien Ashford mattered more. A soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding. Eleanor quickly closed the journal and called for her visitor to enter, expecting a servant with late-night refreshments. Instead, Lucien appeared in the doorway, no longer wearing the formal clothing from their evening meeting. In simple dark trousers and a white shirt open at the throat, he looked younger, more approachable, yet somehow more dangerous. "I apologize for the intrusion," he said, not crossing the threshold. "I wanted to ensure you were comfortable, and to offer you the opportunity to ask whatever questions my revelation may have raised." Eleanor pulled her dressing gown more tightly around herself, acutely aware of the impropriety of receiving a gentleman in her nightclothes. Yet something about his manner, respectful, patient, without the predatory intensity she might have expected from his kind, made her feel safer than she had any right to. "Come in," she said, "but leave the door open. I suspect my reputation can withstand the gossip, but there's no point in courting scandal." He smiled at her practical consideration and settled into the chair by her fire, careful to maintain distance between them. In the flickering light, Eleanor could see the weariness he usually kept hidden, the weight of centuries lived in careful solitude. "You said you became vampire by choice," she began, settling onto the window seat where moonlight could illuminate her face. "What could drive a man to such a decision?" "Grief," he answered simply, "and the arrogance to believe I could outsmart mortality. I had watched Isabel die slowly, helplessly, while I searched desperately for physicians who might save her. When I encountered someone who offered the power to ensure I would never be so helpless again, the choice seemed obvious. But you learned otherwise. I learned that power to preserve life is meaningless when everyone you seek to protect ages beyond your ability to save them anyway. I gained immortality and lost the very thing I had sought to preserve, the possibility of growing old alongside those I loved." Eleanor considered this, thinking of her own children who seemed to view her as an aging inconvenience. "Yet you continued to form attachments. The portraits suggest you did not retreat into isolation. Eventually, yes. It took decades to understand that love is not diminished by its temporary nature. Indeed, perhaps mortality makes it more precious. But the learning was," he paused, searching for words, "educational." She heard volumes in what he did not say, centuries of loss and renewal that had shaped the man sitting across from her. "And now, do you still seek such connections?" Their eyes met in the firelight, and Eleanor felt that strange flutter of awareness again. "I had convinced myself I no longer did," he said quietly, "until this afternoon, when a remarkable woman walked into my hall and reminded me what I had been missing." Heat rose in Eleanor's cheeks, but she did not look away. "I am hardly remarkable, Lord Ashford. I am a widowed diplomat of advancing years, with little to recommend me beyond decent manners and political experience. You are a woman who has survived loss without becoming bitter, who faces uncertainty with courage, and who sees beyond surface appearances to recognize truth. He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Do you realize how rare such qualities are, especially combined in someone whose life experience has taught them their true value? Eleanor felt dangerously close to tears at his assessment. When had anyone last seen such things in her? Her own children viewed her as a burden, her peers as a pleasant but unremarkable widow. Yet this impossible man looked at her and saw qualities worth treasuring. You frighten me, she admitted honestly. Because of what I am? I spent 20 years learning to live with the absence of passion, convincing myself that companionship and duty were sufficient. You make me remember what it felt like to want something beyond mere survival. Lucien was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the mixed light of fire and moon. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle but serious. Eleanor, you must understand what any connection between us would mean. I am not simply an unusual man, I am a creature that requires blood to survive, that will outlive not only you, but any children you might have, any legacy you hope to build. Caring for me would mean accepting things about my nature that most mortals cannot bear to witness. Tell me, she said, surprising herself with her directness. I feed from willing donors among my household, he said, watching her carefully for signs of revulsion. I am stronger and faster than any mortal man, with senses that perceive far more than human awareness allows. I do not age, do not sicken, and heal from injuries that would kill ordinary men. But the greatest difference is the loneliness, Eleanor. The weight of watching everyone you care about fade while you remain unchanged. Eleanor absorbed this information with the same practical assessment she had applied to estate management and political negotiations. The feeding seemed less disturbing than she might have expected, no more shocking than the violence required to put meat on any table. The physical differences were impressive, but not threatening in his careful presentation. But the loneliness resonated with her own experience of isolation. And if someone chose to share that burden, she asked quietly, if they were willing to accept transformation to stand beside you? Something shifted in Lucien's expression, a hope he was clearly afraid to acknowledge. The process is irreversible, he said, and it is not without costs. You would gain my longevity, but lose your mortality. You would need to feed as I do, to accept that your human life had ended and something new had begun. But the loneliness would be shared. Yes, he whispered, it would be shared. Eleanor rose from the window seat and moved toward him, drawn by an impulse she barely understood. When she stopped before his chair, she could see the careful control in his posture, the way he held himself perfectly still to avoid frightening her. I need time to think, she said, about the diplomatic mission, about what you have told me, about what I might be willing to risk for the possibility of connection I thought I would never experience again. Of course. He rose as well, bringing them close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. Take all the time you need, Eleanor. Whatever you decide, I will respect your choice. As he moved toward the door, Eleanor found herself speaking again. Lucien, when you look at me, what do you see? He paused in the doorway, turning back with an expression of such tenderness that her breath caught. I see a woman brave enough to travel alone into unknown territory for a cause she believes in, he said. I see someone who has learned to find strength in survival without losing her capacity for kindness. Most importantly, I see the possibility of companionship I had given up hoping to find. He smiled softly. What do you see when you look at me? Eleanor considered the question seriously. I see a man who has found ways to love despite unimaginable loss. Someone who has chosen again and again to remain connected to life rather than retreat into safety. She paused, gathering courage. I see possibility that terrifies me because I want it so much. Then we understand each other perfectly, he said, and quietly left her to her contemplation. Dawn broke grey and misty over Ravenshollow, but Eleanor was already awake, having spent much of the night wrestling with thoughts that refused to settle into any comfortable pattern. She dressed carefully in her travelling clothes and made her way to the keep's main courtyard, hoping that fresh air and movement might clear her head. What she found instead was Lucien, moving through what appeared to be a complex sword form with deadly precision. He had removed his shirt against the morning's exertion, and Eleanor found herself transfixed by the fluid grace of his movements. The ancient sword in his hands caught the pale sunlight as he flowed. From one position to another, each motion controlled and purposeful. There was violence in the display, certainly, but also artistry, centuries of training distilled into something approaching dance. He became aware of her presence without seeming to look in her direction, completing his current sequence before turning to face her with a slight bow. Sweat gleamed on his skin despite the cool morning air, and Eleanor realized she was staring with an intensity that bordered on impropriety. "Good morning," he said, reaching for a linen towel draped over a nearby fence post. "I apologize if the sound of practice disturbed your rest." "Not at all," Eleanor replied, struggling to keep her voice level. "I have always been an early riser. Your technique is impressive." "A necessity rather than a hobby," he said, pulling his shirt back on with movements that suggested long habit. "When one lives as long as I have, enemies accumulate along with years. It pays to remain prepared." Eleanor approached the weapons rack he had been using, noting the variety of blades displayed there. Each was perfectly maintained, their edges gleaming with oil and careful attention. But one sword in particular caught her eye longer than the others, with intricate engravings along its fuller and a crossguard worn smooth by centuries of use. "This one is special," she observed, not quite touching the blade but admiring its craftsmanship. "It belonged to my father," Lucien said, moving to stand beside her. "Forged when I was still mortal. Blessed by a priest who believed in the righteousness of our cause. I have carried it through 7 centuries of conflict, and it has never drawn innocent blood. A remarkable record for a weapon of war. I learned early that power without restraint becomes mere brutality. The sword reminds me that strength should serve justice, not convenience." He lifted the blade from its rest, handling it with the reverence due a sacred relic. "Would you like to hold it?" Eleanor hesitated, uncertain whether such an offer was appropriate, but something in his manner, respectful, encouraging, made her extend her hands. The sword was heavier than she had expected, yet perfectly balanced. The grip felt warm beneath her fingers, as if the weapon retained some echo of all the hands that had wielded it. "You have some experience with blades," Lucien observed, watching how she tested the weapon's weight and balance. "My father believed daughters should learn to defend themselves," Eleanor replied, adjusting her grip to find the sword's center. "I was quite accomplished with bow and blade in my youth, though I fear 20 years of domestic life have dulled my skills." "Skills like that never truly fade," he said. "They merely wait for necessity to awaken them. Here, let me show you." He moved behind her, his hands covering hers on the sword's grip. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken at his proximity, the warmth of his body against her. Back, his touch was gentle but sure, as he guided her through a basic defensive stance. "Feel the blade's balance," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "Let it become an extension of your arm rather than a burden you carry." Eleanor found it difficult to concentrate on his instruction when she was so acutely aware of his presence. The careful way he positioned her feet, the patient guidance of his hands, the quiet confidence in his voice, all of it combined to create an intimacy she had not anticipated when she wandered into the courtyard seeking solitude. "There," he said, stepping back to observe her stance. "Much better. You have natural grace with a blade." "Flattery, Lord Ashford?" Eleanor asked, lowering the sword and turning to face him. Honest assessment, he replied, though his eyes held warmth that went beyond mere professional evaluation. You move with purpose, Eleanor. It is attractive. Heat flooded her cheeks at his directness. In the growing daylight, with sword still in her hands and Lucien's attention focused entirely on her, Eleanor felt more alive than she had in years. Here was a man who saw strength in her rather than frailty, who encouraged rather than protected. A commotion at the gates interrupted the charged moment between them. Eleanor lowered the sword as a rider approached at dangerous speed, his horse lathered with sweat and his clothes marked by hard travel. Lucien's demeanor shifted immediately, the lover replaced by the lord, as he recognized the urgency of the messenger's approach. Marcus, he called to a man emerging from the keep's main entrance. Eleanor noticed that this individual possessed the same predatory grace as the guards she had encountered yesterday. Another vampire, she realized. The messenger dismounted and approached with a bow that acknowledged Lucien's authority while maintaining his own dignity. "My lord," he said, "urgent news from Lady Eleanor's estates. Enemy forces have moved, faster than anticipated. Her lands are under direct threat." Eleanor felt the sword slip from suddenly nerveless fingers. Her home, her people, the life she had built from the wreckage of widowhood, all of it in danger while she stood in a courtyard, learning swordwork from a vampire lord. The guilt was immediate and overwhelming. "How long do we have?" she asked, her diplomatic training allowing her to function despite the shock. "Perhaps a week, my lady, if the enemy maintains their current pace. Less if they forced march." Lucien moved to her side, his presence steadying without being presumptuous. "We will send word immediately to your garrison. Offer whatever assistance." "No," Eleanor interrupted, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. "If you move openly to assist me, you break the neutrality that protects these lands. The Council's mission becomes irrelevant if you choose sides in this conflict. Your safety matters more than political considerations," Lucien said quietly. Eleanor looked up at him, seeing genuine concern in those grey eyes. Here was a man offering to risk his carefully maintained position for her sake, prepared to abandon neutrality that had protected his people for decades. The magnitude of such an offer, and her own response to it, frightened her almost as much as the threat to her estates. "I must return immediately," she said, though the words felt like ashes in her mouth. "Whatever understanding we might have reached must wait until more urgent matters are resolved. Then I will come with you." "Lucien, no. You cannot abandon Ravenshollow for you?" he finished, moving closer. "Eleanor, in 2 days you have reminded me what it means to hope for companionship, to want something beyond mere survival. Do you truly expect me to let you ride into danger alone?" Eleanor felt tears threaten at his words. How long since anyone had been willing to risk anything for her sake? Her own children viewed her as expendable. The Royal Council had sent her on this mission precisely because her loss would be acceptable. Yet this impossible man was prepared to abandon safety for her welfare. "If you come," she said carefully, "there can be no pretense of neutrality. You will have chosen a side in this war." "I chose a side the moment I showed you my family portraits," he replied. "The moment I allowed myself to hope you might choose to stay." Before Eleanor could respond to this declaration, Marcus approached with the purposeful stride of someone bearing additional unwelcome news. "My lord," he said, "there is more. The messenger reports that Lady Eleanor's diplomatic mission here has been discovered by enemy agents. They know she came to secure your alliance, and they are using it as justification for their attack on her lands." Eleanor felt the world shift around her as the implications became clear. She had not simply failed in her diplomatic mission. Her very presence at Ravenshollow had provided enemies with the excuse they needed to move against her people. Every tenant farmer, every servant, Every person who depended on her protection was now at risk because she had allowed herself to be drawn into impossible attraction to a vampire lord. "It appears," she said with bitter clarity, "that I have already chosen sides without realizing it. The only question now is whether that choice leads to salvation or destruction for everyone I am sworn to protect." Lucien's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with surprising gentleness. "Then we face the consequences together," he said. "Whatever comes next, Eleanor, you do not face it alone." For the first time in 20 years, Eleanor Whitmore felt the terrifying comfort of partnership. Whether it would prove to be her redemption or her doom remained to be seen. The ornate chalice sat on Lucien's study desk like an accusation, its silver surface reflecting the lamplight in patterns that seemed to shift and writhe. Eleanor could not stop staring at it, though every rational part of her mind insisted she should look away from the vessel that represented everything alien about the man she was growing to care for. The blood within appeared almost black in the dim light, yet she could detect the faint metallic scent even from several feet away. "I did not intend for you to see this," Lucien said quietly from his position near the window. He had not moved closer since she had entered his study and discovered him in the act of feeding, if something so civilized could be called by such a crude term. "I usually take care of such necessities in private quarters." Eleanor forced herself to meet his gaze, seeing in his grey eyes the shame he was struggling to conceal. Here was a man who had revealed his deepest vulnerabilities to her, who had offered partnership in the face of approaching danger, now bracing himself for her revulsion at the reality of his nature. "The person who provided this," she said, gesturing toward the chalice with a steadiness that surprised her. "They were willing? Catherine, one of my household. She has been with me for nearly 2 centuries, understands the symbiosis involved." His voice remained carefully neutral, but Eleanor could detect the tension underlying his words. "I take only what is freely offered, only what can be safely spared." Eleanor approached the desk slowly, her practical mind cataloguing details while her emotions warred between fascination and unease. The chalice itself was beautiful, clearly ancient, with engravings that suggested religious significance. There was nothing brutal or predatory about its appearance. It might have been used for communion wine in any cathedral. "Does it hurt them?" she asked. "No more than a physician's bloodletting." "Less, actually, as I am far more careful than most medical practitioners." Lucien moved away from the window, though he maintained distance between them. "The process can even be pleasant for both parties, when conducted with proper care and consent." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks as she absorbed the implications of his words. There was something almost intimate in his description, a suggestion of connection that went beyond mere sustenance. She found herself wondering what it would feel like to offer such trust, such vulnerability to someone who could drain her life with careless greed, yet chose restraint. "You are thinking," Lucien observed, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I can see the questions in your expression. I am trying to reconcile the man who showed me portraits of his beloved dead with the creature who requires blood to survive," Eleanor admitted. "They should be incompatible, yet somehow in you they seem to coexist. Perhaps because I learned early that survival without humanity is merely sophisticated death." He gestured toward the chalice without touching it. "This sustains my body. But relationships, connections, the choice to remain engaged with life, those sustain something far more essential." A knock at the study door interrupted their conversation. At Lucien's call to enter, a woman appeared whose beauty struck Eleanor like a physical blow. Tall and graceful, with auburn hair that caught the lamplight and green eyes that held depths of experience, she moved with the fluid, predatory grace Eleanor was learning to associate with vampires. Yet her manner as she approached seemed warm rather than threatening. "My lord," she said, offering a curtsy that acknowledged rank while maintaining her own dignity, "I came to see if you required anything further this evening." Catherine, Lucien said, rising with obvious respect, please meet Lady Eleanor Whitmore. Eleanor, this is Catherine Montrose, who manages much of Ravenshallow's daily operations and serves as my oldest advisor. Catherine's gaze settled on Eleanor with intelligent assessment. The diplomat, she said, though not unkindly. We have heard much about you, Lady Whitmore. Nothing too unflattering, I hope, Eleanor replied, offering her own curtsy. She was acutely aware that she was meeting the woman whose blood currently sat in the chalice before her, yet Catherine showed no signs of weakness or coercion. On the contrary, Catherine said with a smile that seemed genuinely warm, Lucien speaks of you with considerable admiration. It has been refreshing to see him so engaged with the present rather than dwelling in memory. Eleanor glanced at Lucien, noting the slight colour that rose in his cheeks at Catherine's observation. You have known him long, since 1823, Catherine replied matter-of-factly. I was dying of consumption when he found me, alone and abandoned by family who feared contagion. He offered me a choice: die slowly and in agony, or accept transformation and learn to live again. You do not regret the decision? Catherine considered the question. Seriously. I regret the circumstances that made it necessary. I sometimes mourn the mortal life I might have lived. But I do not regret the years I have gained, the knowledge I have accumulated, or the family I have found among others like myself. She glanced meaningfully at Lucien. Immortality need not mean isolation, Lady Whitmore, if one is wise enough to choose companions rather than servants. Eleanor absorbed this perspective, understanding that Catherine was offering more than casual conversation. Here was a woman who had faced the same impossible choice Eleanor herself might soon confront, who had found ways to build meaningful existence within the constraints of vampiric nature. The blood you provided, Eleanor said carefully, it does not diminish you. No more than any other gift freely given to someone I care about, Catherine replied simply. Perhaps less, as it regenerates within days and costs me nothing essential. Lucien had been silent during this exchange, but Eleanor could feel his attention focused intensely on her reactions. When Catherine excused herself moments later, citing administrative duties that needed attention, Eleanor found herself alone with him and the tangible evidence of what he was. She is remarkable, Eleanor said finally. She is what I hope any companion of mine might become, Lucien replied. Someone who has found ways to thrive within limitations rather than merely endure them. Eleanor moved closer to the desk, her gaze returning to the chalice. In the lamplight, the blood within no longer seemed quite so alien. It was sustenance, certainly, but also symbol of trust, given and received, of needs acknowledged rather than hidden, of relationships built on honesty rather than comfortable deceptions. If someone chose to accept transformation, she said quietly, would they require the same sustenance? Yes, Lucien answered, his voice carefully neutral despite the weight of the question, though the transition can be gradual, and the amounts required are smaller than most imagine. From willing donors? Always. I would never permit anything else within my household. Eleanor reached out and touched the chalice's rim, feeling the cool silver against her fingertips. The vessel was surprisingly warm, as if it retained some echo of the life it had contained. She found herself imagining what it would mean to offer such trust, to accept such responsibility for another's needs. The external threats to my lands, she said, changing subjects with deliberate effort, they force decisions I am not prepared to make. What decisions? Eleanor met his gaze directly. Whether to return and face almost certain defeat alone, or to accept help that would transform everything I understand about my life and duties. She paused, gathering courage. Whether to choose safety or partnership, duty or possibility. And what does your heart counsel? My heart, Eleanor said with a rueful smile, is proving to be far more reckless than my mind ever suspected. It whispers that 20 years of cautious survival might be sufficient preparation for whatever courage the future requires. Lucien rose and moved around the desk, stopping close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. Courage, Eleanor, often looks remarkably like the willingness to trust someone else with our vulnerabilities. Is that what you are asking of me? I am asking for nothing, he replied gently. I am simply hoping you might choose everything. Eleanor looked up into those grey eyes that held centuries of experience, seeing in them the promise of partnership she had never dared imagine. The chalice sat forgotten on the desk behind her as she reached for a future that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Eleanor's mother's locket felt unusually heavy against her throat as she stood on Ravenshallow's battlements, watching the distant smoke that marked the approach of enemy forces. The delicate gold case contained a miniature portrait of her parents, stern, dutiful people who had raised her to understand obligation above all else. She could almost hear her mother's voice across the decades, reminding her that Whitmore women did not abandon their responsibilities for personal desires, no matter how compelling those desires might be. "The reports are confirmed," Marcus said, approaching with the grim expression she had learned to associate with unwelcome news. 3 companies of enemy cavalry, moving faster than anticipated. They will reach your estates by tomorrow evening, at the latest. Eleanor absorbed this information with the same calm she had applied to household crises and political setbacks throughout her adult life. Yet beneath the surface composure, her heart raced with awareness of how much had changed since she first arrived at Ravenshollow. The woman who had undertaken this diplomatic mission would have departed immediately to defend her lands with whatever resources she could muster. The woman she was becoming found herself calculating entirely different possibilities. "How many can we save if we retreat to the keep?" she asked. "Perhaps half the population, if they leave immediately and travel light," Marcus replied. "But Lady Eleanor, you must understand bringing them here would end any pretense of neutrality. We would be choosing sides in this conflict openly." Eleanor touched the locket absently, feeling the weight of generations of family duty pressing against her desire to protect her people through any means necessary. "And the alternative is to watch them die while we maintain political convenience." "The alternative," Lucien's voice said from behind her, "is to acknowledge that some choices transcend political calculation." She turned to find him approaching with Catherine and several other members of his household, all vampires. She now realized, all bound together by shared transformation and mutual loyalty. In the fading daylight, their pale skin seemed to glow with its own inner luminescence, and Eleanor understood that she was looking at something far more dangerous than a simple, noble household. "You have decided something," she observed, reading the resolution in Lucien's expression. "We have decided," he corrected, gesturing to include his vampire family, "that neutrality purchased through the suffering of innocence is worthless. If protecting your people requires choosing sides, then we choose yours." Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion at his words. When had anyone last risked anything significant for her sake? Her own children viewed her as expendable. The Royal Council had sent her here precisely because her loss would be acceptable. Yet these immortal beings were prepared to abandon carefully maintained safety for her welfare. "The enemy forces are substantial," she warned. "Well-armed, experienced, backed by resources we cannot match through. Conventional means," Catherine said with a smile that revealed the tips of elongated canines, "are not our specialty." A sound like distant thunder drew their attention back to the valley below, where the first enemy scouts had appeared on the horizon. Eleanor watched through Lucien's spyglass as mounted soldiers surveyed the approach to Ravenshollow, noting defensive positions and calculating assault strategies. They moved with the confidence of those who expected easy victory against a neutrally held fortress. "They do not know what they face," Marcus observed with grim satisfaction. "More importantly," Lucien said, his voice taking on an edge Eleanor had not heard before. "They do not know what Eleanor faces alongside us." She lowered the spyglass and turned to look at him, seeing in his grey eyes a transformation that was both thrilling and terrifying. This was not the careful, controlled diplomat she had met 3 days ago, but something far more primal, a predator preparing to defend his territory and the woman he had claimed as his own. "You would risk everything you have built here," she said, "for people you have never met, lands you gain nothing by protecting." "I would risk it for you," he replied simply, "because in 3 days, Eleanor Whitmore, you have become more precious to me than centuries of careful neutrality." The raw honesty in his declaration struck her like a physical blow. Eleanor had spent decades believing herself past the age of inspiring such devotion, convinced that whatever capacity she had possessed for evoking love had died with her youth. Yet here was a man who had lived through centuries, offering her partnership that transcended political convenience or social expectation. "If we do this," she said carefully, "if we stand together against this threat, there will be consequences beyond the immediate battle. My relationship with the Crown will be compromised. Your position in the broader conflict will be established, and whatever exists between us will be tested in ways neither of us can predict." "Are you prepared for such consequences?" Catherine asked, her green eyes studying Eleanor with frank assessment. Eleanor considered the question seriously, weighing duty against desire, obligation against possibility. The locket at her throat seemed to pulse with the weight of family expectation, reminding her that Whitmore women had always chosen responsibility over personal happiness. Yet as she looked around at the faces surrounding her immortal beings, who had found ways to build family from choice rather than blood, she wondered if perhaps there were different kinds of responsibility to consider. "My mother," she said, opening the locket to reveal the stern-faced woman within, "believed that duty required sacrifice of personal desires for the greater good. She would tell me to return immediately to my estates, to face whatever comes alone rather than compromise. Others, through association with my difficulties." "And what do you believe?" Lucien asked quietly. "I believe that 20 years of dutiful widowhood may have taught me the difference between obligation and purpose. My duty to my people does not require me to fail in their defense simply to maintain political appearances." "Then you will accept our assistance." "I will accept partnership," she corrected, the distinction important to her sense of dignity. "I will not be rescued like some helpless maiden, but I will stand alongside allies who have chosen to share the risks I face." Lucien's smile in response held warmth that seemed to chase away the evening's chill. "Partners, then, in battle, in whatever follows, in whatever future we can build from the choices we make tonight." Eleanor felt something settle into place within her chest. Not the desperate flutter of unexpected attraction, but the deeper satisfaction of recognition between equals. Here was a man who saw strength in her rather than frailty, who offered collaboration rather than protection. Whether they survived the approaching conflict or not, she had found something she thought lost forever: the possibility of being known and valued for everything she was, rather than accepted despite her limitations. "The enemy will reach us by full dark," Marcus reported, returning from another observation of their advance. "We should prepare defensive positions and decide which civilians can be evacuated safely." "No evacuations," Eleanor said firmly. "We protect them here, all of them. If we are choosing sides in this conflict, let us choose completely." As the household dispersed to begin preparations, Lucien remained beside her on the battlements. In the growing darkness, Eleanor could see lights beginning to flicker in the valley below enemy campfires that marked the beginning of siege. Tomorrow would bring violence and quite possibly death, yet she felt more alive than she had in decades. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "I want you to know that these 3 days at Ravenshollow have given me back something I thought permanently lost." "What is that?" Eleanor smiled, touching the locket that had seemed to approve of her decision despite her mother's long-dead objections. "Hope," she said simply, "the courage to choose partnership over safety, possibility over mere survival." In the distance, war drums began to sound. Eleanor discovered the hidden compartment purely by accident, her finger catching on a loose stone while she examined maps in Lucien's study. The ancient mechanism clicked softly, revealing a narrow space behind the wall that contained documents she had never seen before. As she unfolded the first parchment, her blood turned cold at the familiar seal, her own family's crest, marking correspondence that should not have existed. The binding contract lay before her in elegant script, dated 3 months before her diplomatic mission had been proposed. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read terms that reframed everything she thought she understood about her presence at Ravenshollow. This was not a hasty assignment born from military necessity, but a carefully orchestrated trap that had been planned for seasons in advance. Lady Eleanor Whitmore, the document read, shall be dispatched to Ravenshollow, keep under pretense of diplomatic negotiation. Her advanced age and expendable status make her ideal for this purpose. Upon her death or disappearance, the Crown shall have justification for military action against the vampire Lord Lucien Ashford, whose neutrality has become inconvenient to our broader strategic goals. The signature at the bottom belonged to Lord Chancellor Aldrich, but beneath it were others nobles she recognized, councillors who had spoken kindly to her at court, men who had seemed to respect her diplomatic capabilities. All of them had known she was being sent to die, had planned her sacrifice as deliberately as they might plan a feast or a tournament. "Eleanor," Lucien's voice came from the doorway, concern evident in his tone. "What have you found?" She could not speak, could only hand him the document with fingers that had gone numb with shock. Eleanor watched his expression change as he read, saw understanding, and then fury transform his features into something predatory and dangerous. When he looked up at her again, his grey eyes held depths of rage she had never seen before. "How long have you known?" she whispered. "I suspected from the beginning that your mission was not what it appeared," he admitted, moving to the wall and pressing another hidden mechanism. A second compartment opened, revealing additional documents that painted an even more damning picture. "But I did not know the full extent of the deception until these arrived yesterday." Eleanor took the new papers with hands that shook, reading confirmation of her worst fears. The attack on her lands had not been a fortunate coincidence. For enemies seeking to exploit her absence, it had been coordinated with her dispatch to Ravenshollow. While she negotiated with vampires, her people had been left deliberately vulnerable to forces that had been encouraged to see her estates as easy targets. "My children," she said, the words coming out strangled. "Do they know?" Lucien's silence was answer enough. Eleanor sank into the chair before his desk, understanding flooding through her with sickening clarity. William's efficiency in political matters, Margaret's convenient absence from court during the mission planning, James's sudden departure on extended travels, all of it had been coordinated to ensure none of them would be positioned to object when their mother was offered as expendable sacrifice. "They needed my death to appear legitimate," she said, her voice hollow with realization. "A tragic diplomatic failure that would justify war against you, while conveniently removing their obligation to support an aging mother whose inheritance they have already calculated." "Eleanor." "No," she interrupted, rising with sudden energy born from fury. "Do not offer comfort for this. Let me feel the full weight of how thoroughly I have been betrayed by people I trusted, people I bore and raised and protected." Lucienne approached carefully, as if she were a wild creature that might bolt at sudden movement. "There is more you need to know." "More?" Eleanor laughed bitterly. "What else could possibly—" He handed her a third document, this one bearing a seal she did not recognize, an ancient symbol that seemed to shift and writhe in the lamplight. The text was written in a dialect that took her several moments to decipher, but when understanding came, it struck her like a physical blow. "The contract with the enemy forces," she read aloud, her voice growing stronger with anger. Payment for attack on Whitmore lands, contingent upon confirmation of Lady Eleanor's death or transformation at Ravenshollow Keep. Additional compensation provided for evidence suitable for propaganda purposes. The attack on your lands was never intended to succeed completely, Lucien explained, his voice carefully controlled. It was meant to provide justification for your desperate alliance with me, making your eventual death or transformation appear to be the inevitable result of dealing with monsters. Eleanor set the document down with deliberate precision, her mind working through implications with the clarity that came from pure rage. Who orchestrated this? The Crown lacks the sophistication for such layered deception. Lord Valerius Draven, Lucien said, and Eleanor heard centuries of enmity in the way he spoke the name. An ancient vampire who has spent decades maneuvering various mortal kingdoms toward conflict. He seeks to eliminate me because I have refused to acknowledge his authority over other vampires in this region, and he needed a justification that would satisfy mortal politics. Precisely. A widowed noblewoman seduced by vampire influence, her lands ravaged as a result, her death serving as perfect evidence of why my kind should be exterminated. Lucien's expression darkened further. He has used mortal allies before, promising them power and longevity in exchange for service. Your Chancellor and several court nobles have been his agents for years. Eleanor absorbed this revelation with grim satisfaction. The betrayal was vast enough to be almost impersonal, not simply familial greed or political convenience, but cosmic manipulation by forces that viewed mortals as expendable pieces in games played across centuries. Marcus knew, she said, understanding suddenly why the vampire lieutenant had seemed so protective despite his apparent hostility. He suspected the truth from your first night here. That is why he has been watching you so carefully, not because he disapproved of your presence, but because he feared you might be an unwitting agent of our destruction. Eleanor stood and moved to the window, looking out over the courtyard where enemy forces were establishing siege positions. In the torchlight, she could see soldiers moving with practiced efficiency, preparing for assault that would serve purposes far beyond simple military conquest. Her death would justify genocidal war, while her survival would require accepting transformation into the very creature their propaganda would paint as seductive evil. What does Draven gain from your destruction? She asked. Control over the mountain passes, certainly, but more importantly, elimination of the example I represent. Lucien joined her at the window, his presence solid and reassuring despite the magnitude of deception they faced. I have spent centuries proving that vampires can coexist peacefully with mortals, that transformation need not mean abandonment of humanity. Draven prefers the old ways, vampires as predators, ruling through fear and manipulation, like he has done with the nobles at court. Exactly. My existence threatens his philosophy by demonstrating alternatives he prefers to keep hidden. Eleanor felt a strange calm settling over her as she processed the full scope of their situation. The diplomatic mission that had brought her to Ravenshollow had been fraudulent from its inception, yet it had led to discoveries that transcended political manipulation. She had been sent here to die, but instead had found reasons to truly live. The forces surrounding us, she said, they expect to find a victim and a monster. What they will discover instead is partnership that their plans cannot accommodate. Lucien turned to study her profile in the window's reflection. You are remarkably calm for someone who has just learned the extent of her betrayal. I am furious, Eleanor corrected, but also liberated. For 3 days I have wrestled with guilt over abandoning duty for personal desire. Now I discover that duty was always an illusion, that the obligations I thought I owed were owed to people who planned my destruction. She faced him directly. I am free, Lucien, in ways I never imagined possible. Free to choose what? Eleanor smiled, feeling lightness she had not experienced since youth. Free to choose partnership over politics, transformation over tradition, Love over the expectations of people who never valued my life beyond its utility to them. The choice still carries enormous costs. All meaningful choices do, she interrupted. But for the first time in 20 years, I am making a choice based on what I want rather than what others expect of me. Eleanor moved closer to him, close enough to see the hope he was afraid to acknowledge. I choose you, Lucien Ashford. I choose transformation, immortality, and whatever future we can build together. Even knowing the price? Especially knowing the price, she replied firmly. I have been dead in all the ways that matter for 2 decades. If I must become vampire to truly live again, then that is a bargain I accept gladly. Outside, siege engines began their ominous approach, but Eleanor felt only anticipation. The woman who had arrived at Ravenshollow as expendable diplomat was about to discover what she might become when she stopped allowing others to define her worth. The transformation chamber lay deep beneath Ravenshallow's foundations, carved from living stone and marked with symbols that predated any kingdom Eleanor knew. Ancient beyond imagining, the circular room radiated power that made the air itself feel thick with possibility. Candles burned in wall niches with flames that cast no smoke, their light reflecting off polished surfaces that seemed to hold depths no natural stone should possess. Lucien stood before an altar-like table at the chamber's center, his expression grave as he explained what the transformation would require. Eleanor listened with the same careful attention she had once brought to estate management, understanding that accepting this change meant embracing mysteries that would reshape everything she thought she knew about existence itself. The process cannot be reversed, he said, his voice echoing strangely in the stone chamber. Once begun, you will either emerge as vampire or die in the attempt. There is no middle ground, no partial transformation that would allow you to reconsider. Eleanor nodded, moving closer to examine the table where she would soon lay. The stone was warm beneath her palm, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to pulse with their own inner rhythm. She found the sensation oddly comforting rather than threatening, as if the chamber recognized her decision and approved. "How long will it take?" she asked. "Hours for the initial change, days for complete integration. You will experience pain unlike anything mortal flesh can normally endure, followed by disorientation as your senses expand beyond human limitations." Lucien's eyes never left her face, searching for any sign of second thoughts. "Your first hunger will be intense. Will you be with me throughout?" "Every moment," he promised. "Though there may be times when you do not recognize me, when the transformation makes everything seem alien and threatening." Above them, the sounds of siege preparation filtered through layers of stone. Eleanor could hear the distant crash of siege engines being assembled, the shouted orders of commanders preparing for assault. The enemy expected to find a terrified diplomat and an isolated vampire lord. Instead, they would face united immortals prepared to fight for something worth preserving. Marcus appeared in the chamber's entrance, his expression grim with news Eleanor had been expecting. "The outer defenses are breached," he reported. "Enemy forces will reach the keep proper within 2 hours." "And our people?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew her question extended beyond the original residents to include everyone who had found sanctuary within Ravenshallow's walls. "Safe within the inner fortress, though the children are frightened and some of the adults question whether harboring you was wise." Marcus's tone carried no judgment, merely practical assessment of civilian morale during siege. Eleanor felt a familiar weight of responsibility settle across her shoulders. These people faced danger because of choices she had made, because her very presence had drawn enemies who sought to use her as justification for violence. Yet she no longer carried the crushing guilt that had defined her relationship with duty for decades. The betrayal that had sent her to Ravenshollow had freed her from obligations to people who valued her only as expendable tool. "Catherine has the civilian defenses organized?" Lucien asked. "Efficiently as always. She has also prepared refreshments for after Eleanor's Transformation. Marcus's careful phrasing made clear he was speaking of blood supplies, the sustenance Eleanor would require once the change was complete. Eleanor appreciated his delicacy, even as she steeled herself for realities that would have horrified her a week ago. The woman who had arrived at Ravenshollow carrying decades of guilt and self-denial was about to become someone entirely new, someone powerful enough to protect rather than merely endure, connected rather than isolated. "My final letters," she said, retrieving papers from her traveling case. "For my children, should they survive what comes next and ever wonder what became of their mother." The letters had taken hours to write, careful explanations that acknowledged the love she bore William, Margaret, and James, while refusing to apologize for choosing partnership over their expectations. She had written honestly about discovering their complicity in her betrayal, yet also about finding forgiveness through understanding that they had been manipulated by forces beyond their comprehension. "You still hope for reconciliation," Lucien observed, reading her expression rather than her private correspondence. "I hope they will someday understand that their mother found the courage to choose love over duty," Eleanor replied. "Whether they approve of that choice matters less than whether they learn from it." Lucien accepted the letters with careful hands, understanding the trust implicit in his role as guardian of her final mortal thoughts. "They will be delivered safely, whatever the outcome of this night." Eleanor moved to the chamber's walls, studying symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the candlelight. She recognized some elements from ancient texts, protective wards, binding formulae, invocations that called upon powers older than recorded history. This was not simply a room where vampires were created, but a sacred space where mortality was consciously abandoned for something, both greater and more terrible. "The enemy forces include more than mortal soldiers," Marcus said, his voice carefully controlled. "Draven has brought others of our kind, vampires who serve his vision of what our people should become." "How many?" Lucien asked, though his attention remained focused on Eleanor. "Perhaps a dozen, though some are older and more powerful than our household can match." Marcus paused meaningfully. "They will not simply seek to kill you, my lord. They will attempt capture, public execution, designed to terrify mortals and demonstrate the futility of resistance." Eleanor felt cold, understanding settle in her stomach. This was not warfare as she understood it, but theater designed to reshape how both mortals and vampires viewed the possibility of coexistence. Draven needed Lucien's destruction to be spectacular enough to eliminate hope for any alternative to vampiric dominance. "Then we must ensure they face more than they expect," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "A transformed Eleanor Whitmore presents complications their plans do not anticipate. You understand the risks," Lucien said, moving to stand before her. In the chamber's ethereal light, he looked both ancient and timeless, a creature of power, choosing vulnerability through connection. "Once you accept transformation, you become target as well as ally. Draven will view you as abomination mortal who chose vampirism freely rather than accepting it as punishment or conquest." "Let him," Eleanor replied, reaching up to touch his face with fingers that would soon possess supernatural strength. "I have spent 20 years being dismissed as harmless widow, underestimated by people who thought they understood my limitations. Perhaps it is time to discover what happens when I stop accepting their definitions." Sounds from above grew more intense, shouts, weapon clash, the splintering of wood as outer gates gave way to enemy assault. Eleanor could hear fear in some voices, determination in others, but underlying it all was the steady heartbeat of community under threat. These people had welcomed her despite the danger her presence represented. Now she would have power to protect them properly. "The transformation must begin soon," Lucien said, glancing toward the chamber's entrance, where flickering light suggested fires had been started in the upper levels. "Once battle is fully engaged, we cannot risk interruption during the most vulnerable moments." Eleanor nodded, moving toward the stone table with decision born from certainty rather than desperation. She had made her choice not from fear of death, but from desire for life worth living. Whatever emerged from this ancient chamber would be shaped by partnership rather than isolation, purpose rather than mere survival. "Before we begin," she said, turning to face Lucien directly, "I want you to understand something. This choice is not driven by circumstances or lack of sampling, alternatives. I am not accepting transformation because I am trapped, but because I have found something worth transforming for." "And what is that?" Eleanor smiled, feeling peace settle over her despite the chaos above. "The possibility of standing beside someone who sees strength in me rather than frailty, who offers partnership rather than protection." She paused, gathering words for thoughts she had never expected to voice. The chance to love and be loved without the shadow of inevitable loss, to build something that transcends the limitations mortality places on connection. Lucien's answer came not in words, but in the careful way he began preparing the chamber for ritual that would bind their fates together. Eleanor watched him work with hands that had performed this ceremony before, knowing that this time carried significance beyond mere transformation. They were not simply creating a new vampire, but forging partnership that would reshape how both of them understood possibility. Above them, the sounds of battle grew closer. Below, in stone chamber lit by flames that burned without consuming, Eleanor Whitmore prepared to discover who she might become when she finally chose desire over duty, partnership over solitude, transformation over the careful preservation of a life that had never truly belonged to her. The woman who would emerge from this place would carry centuries ahead of her, power beyond mortal imagination, and the unprecedented freedom that came from choosing love over every safe alternative. Whether the world was ready for such a creature remained to be seen. Eleanor's transformation completed just as enemy forces breached the chamber doors above, the timing so precise it seemed orchestrated by fate itself. The new fangs in her mouth felt strange yet natural, as if they had always belonged there, waiting for her to claim them. Every sensation blazed with intensity that made her former human perception seem like viewing the world through thick glass suddenly shattered to reveal colors, sounds, and scents beyond anything she had imagined possible. The pain that had racked her body for hours vanished instantly, replaced by strength that hummed through her veins like lightning. When she sat up from the stone table, the movement was fluid, controlled, yet she could sense the power coiled beneath her skin, waiting to be unleashed. Lucien's face above her came into sharp focus, every line and expression visible despite the chamber's dim lighting. "How do you feel?" he asked softly, his voice carrying harmonics she had never heard before. "Magnificent," Eleanor whispered, and even her own voice sounded different, richer, carrying undertones that spoke of depths newly acquired. "And hungry." The hunger was unlike anything mortal experience had prepared her for. It went beyond physical need to something that touched the core of her being, demanding satisfaction with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. Yet, even in its urgency, Eleanor found she retained complete control of her faculties. The transformation had amplified her nature rather than replacing it. Later, Lucien promised, understanding her need. "First, we have guests to greet." Sounds of battle from the floors above had grown more intense, with crashes and shouts that suggested the enemy had penetrated deeper into the keep than anticipated. Eleanor rose from the table with movements that felt impossibly graceful, her body responding to intentions with precision that delighted her newly awakened senses. "They are close," she said, though she was uncertain how she knew this. Information seemed to flow to her from sources she could not identify, sounds beyond normal human hearing, scents that carried detailed intelligence about numbers and intentions. "Your abilities will strengthen over the coming days," Lucien explained, moving to arm himself with the ancient sword she had admired during their courtyard training. "For now, Trust your instincts. They will guide you more accurately than conscious thought. Marcus appeared in the chamber's entrance, his clothes torn and bloodied from fighting that had clearly been intense. "My lord, they have taken the great hall. Draven himself leads the assault, and he has brought the Ancient Ones as promised." Eleanor felt something shift inside her at the mention of their enemy's name. Where once she might have felt fear at facing creatures with centuries of experience in violence, now she felt only anticipation. The woman who had arrived at Ravenshollow as expendable diplomat was gone, replaced by someone who possessed power to match any threat. "How many of our people?" Lucien asked. "All safe within the inner sanctuary, though Catherine requests immediate assistance. The enemy has brought fire." Eleanor moved toward the weapons rack without conscious decision, her hands selecting a blade that felt perfectly balanced, despite her complete lack of experience. With vampiric strength, the sword seemed to recognize her touch, its weight distributing itself along her arm, as if it had been crafted specifically for her grip. "Eleanor," Lucien said carefully, "your first battle as vampire carries particular risks. The hunger, combined with combat intensity, can overwhelm new vampires' judgment." "Then you must trust me to maintain mine," she replied, testing the sword's balance with movements that felt natural despite being impossible moments before. "I have spent 20 years learning self-control under pressure. Transformation may have changed my nature, but it has not eliminated my character." A tremendous crash from above suggested that the enemy had broken through another defensive position. Eleanor could hear individual heartbeats among the chaos, rapid with fear, steady with determination, cold with predatory anticipation. The sounds painted a picture more detailed than sight could provide. "They are separating our defenders," she said, understanding tactics being employed without seeing the battle directly. Driving Catherine's group toward the east wing, while Marcus's forces are pinned in the western approaches. Both vampires stared at her in amazement. "How can you possibly know that?" Marcus asked. "I can hear them," Eleanor said simply. "Individual voices, heartbeats, breathing patterns. The enemy commander is coordinating attacks from the gallery level, using hand signals to avoid vocal commands that might be overheard." Lucien's expression shifted to something approaching awe. "Your transformation is unusual, Eleanor. Most new vampires require weeks to develop such sensory integration. Perhaps because I came to this change through choice rather than desperation," she replied, moving toward the chamber's exit with purpose that surprised her. "I am not fighting against my new nature, but embracing it completely." They ascended toward battle through corridors that Eleanor now perceived with devastating clarity. Every stone, every shadow, every trace of scent left by passage told stories she could read like text. The keep's layout mapped itself in her mind with precision that would have taken days to acquire through normal study. When they reached the main level, Eleanor's first sight of vampiric combat took her breath away. Catherine moved through enemy soldiers with grace that was beautiful and terrible, her movements flowing like dance while dealing death with surgical precision. Yet even her supernatural abilities were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers and strategic coordination. "Now," Lucien said, raising his ancient sword, "we discover what partnership in battle truly means." Eleanor stepped into her first fight as an immortal creature, feeling power course through her transformed body as she embraced the violence that would determine whether their love story ended in triumph or tragedy. The banner of Ravenshollow flew defiantly from the keep's highest tower as Eleanor and Lucien fought side by side in the great hall, their combined abilities creating devastation that Draven's forces had not anticipated. Eleanor moved with deadly grace that seemed impossible for someone transformed mere hours ago, her political mind translating into tactical awareness that turned the tide of battle with surgical precision. Impossible. Draven snarled from his position near the hall's main entrance, his ancient features twisted with fury at seeing his carefully laid plans crumbling. She should be weak, disoriented, easy prey for experienced vampires. Eleanor heard his words clearly, despite the chaos of combat around them. Her enhanced senses tracked multiple conversations simultaneously, while her body flowed through sword forms that felt like recovered memories rather than new skills. When enemy vampires attempted to surround her, she anticipated their movements with an accuracy that shocked even Lucien. "Your mistake," she called to Draven, while parrying attacks from two opponents simultaneously was assuming transformation would diminish me rather than complete me. The ancient vampire lord's eyes blazed with rage at her defiance. For centuries, he had orchestrated the destruction of vampires who refused to acknowledge his authority, using mortal politics as tools to eliminate threats to his vision of vampiric supremacy. Eleanor's willing transformation represented everything he sought to destroy: choice over coercion, partnership over dominance, love over fear. "You are abomination," he spat, advancing through the battle with power that made the air itself seem to thicken. "Mortal weakness, embracing vampiric strength for sentimental purposes. You understand nothing of what you have become." Eleanor felt something cold and deadly settle in her chest at his words. Here was the creature who had orchestrated her betrayal, who had manipulated her own children into complicity with plans for her death, who viewed love as weakness to be exploited rather than strength to be celebrated. "I understand perfectly," she replied, her voice carrying across the hall with authority that made combat pause around them. "I understand that you fear what Lucien and I represent: the possibility that vampires need not be monsters, that transformation can serve creation rather than destruction." Draven's laugh was harsh and bitter. Pretty words from a woman who has been vampire for less than a day. When the hunger truly takes you, when you realize what you have sacrificed for this foolish romance, you will beg for the simplicity of predatory existence. "Then let us test your theory," Eleanor said, moving toward him with purposeful stride that cleared enemies from her path through sheer force of presence. Their first clash sent shockwaves through the hall, ancient power meeting newly awakened strength in collision that shattered stone and sent lesser combatants scrambling for safety. Eleanor discovered that her political instincts translated perfectly into combat strategy, reading Draven's intentions through subtle tells, exploiting his assumptions about her capabilities, using his own arrogance against him. "You fight like someone with nothing to lose," he observed, pressing an attack that would have overwhelmed most vampires. "I fight like someone who has everything to gain," Eleanor corrected, her blade finding gaps in his defense that centuries of experience had not taught him to guard. "I fight for partnership, for community, for the right to choose love over power." Lucien appeared beside her, his ancient sword singing as it joined her assault. Together, they moved with synchronization that spoke of deep understanding rather than mere coordination. Where Eleanor's attacks were precise and calculated, his were flowing and intuitive. Where his strength was overwhelming, hers was surgical. They fought not as individual vampires, but as unified force that multiplied their separate capabilities. "This is what you fear," Eleanor said to Draven as their combined assault drove him back toward the hall's great fireplace. "Not vampires choosing mortality's weaknesses, but vampires discovering mortality's strengths: connection, sacrifice, the willingness to risk everything for something greater than individual survival." Draven's response was wordless rage, his attacks becoming wilder as he realized that Eleanor's transformation had not created the vulnerable weapon he had intended to use against Lucien, but rather forged alliance that threatened his entire philosophy of vampiric existence. The battle reached its crescendo when Catherine and Marcus, having defeated the last of Draven's mortal soldiers, joined the confrontation. 4 vampires, united by choice rather than coercion, faced the ancient lord whose power had seemed unassailable moments before. In their coordinated movement, Eleanor saw reflected the family she had never expected to find: bonds forged through mutual respect rather than blood or fear. Yield, Lucien commanded, his sword at Draven's throat, while Eleanor's blade rested against the ancient vampire's heart. "Your war ends here. You think this victory changes anything?" Draven gasped, his form beginning to dissolve as he prepared some final desperate gambit. "Mortals will never accept creatures like you. This peace you imagine is illusion that will shatter the moment they remember what vampires truly are." Eleanor smiled, feeling certainty settle in her transformed heart. "Then we will prove them wrong, one choice at a time, one relationship at a time, one partnership at a time." Her blade found its mark, just as Draven's form completed its dissolution, his centuries of accumulated malice dissipating like smoke in the hall's warming light. Around them, the sounds of battle faded as enemy forces, deprived of their leader's coordination, began surrendering or fleeing into the night. Eleanor stood amid the wreckage of Ravenshallow's great hall, victorious banner still flying above them, and realized that her transformation was complete in ways that went far beyond vampiric change. The woman who had arrived as expendable diplomat had discovered what she might become when she chose partnership over safety, love over duty, courage over the careful preservation of a life that had never truly belonged to her. 6 months after the battle at Ravenshollow, Eleanor stood before a polished silver mirror in chambers that had become truly hers, studying a reflection that still surprised her with its vitality. The woman looking back possessed the same features she had worn for 57 years, yet everything about her seemed more vivid, more present. Her hair held luster that mortal locks could never achieve. Her skin bore the luminous quality that marked successful transformation. And her eyes held depths that spoke of experiences no ordinary human could imagine. The new covenant lay on her writing desk, its pages filled with carefully negotiated terms that would govern relations between mortal kingdoms and vampire territories for generations to come. Eleanor's signature appeared alongside those of kings, chancellors, and vampire lords, marking her role as architect of peace that had seemed impossible when she first arrived at this ancient keep. The document represented more than diplomatic achievement. It was proof that love could indeed reshape the world when given sufficient courage and wisdom. Still marveling at the changes, Lucien asked from the doorway, his voice carrying the warm affection that had become their daily music. Eleanor turned to face her partner, her husband in all but mortal ceremony, feeling the familiar flutter of awareness that vampiric senses had only intensified. Even after months of shared existence, the sight of him still stirred something deep in her transformed heart, not the desperate attraction of their early courtship, but the steady satisfaction of recognition between equals. "I was thinking about time," she replied, moving toward him with the fluid grace that had become second nature. "How strange it is to contemplate centuries ahead of us when I spent so many years believing my story was essentially finished." Lucien's arms came around her with careful tenderness, their embrace carrying the weight of infinity, promised and accepted. Through the window behind him, Eleanor could see the village that had grown up around Ravenshallow's base, expanded now to accommodate refugees from the recent conflict and mortals who chose to live under vampire protection. Gardens flourished where battlefields had been, children played where siege engines had once stood, and the sound of construction spoke of community building rather than defensive preparation. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "The choice to leave your mortal life behind?" Eleanor considered the question with the honesty their relationship demanded. "I regret the pain my transformation caused people I loved, even those who betrayed me. I regret that my children may never understand why I chose partnership over their expectations." She paused, gathering thoughts that still carried complexity despite months of processing. "But I do not regret the choice itself. How could I regret discovering what I am capable of when finally free to choose based on desire rather than duty?" Letters from William, Margaret, and James lay in neat stacks on her desk, their contents varying from confused concern to outright accusation to Most recently, tentative attempts at understanding. Her eldest son had written with grudging respect for her role in negotiating peace that protected his own estates. Margaret had sent careful inquiries about vampire society that suggested curiosity beneath her stated disapproval. James, perhaps predictably, had requested financial assistance while simultaneously expressing horror at his mother's transformation. "They will need time to accept what I have become," Eleanor said, following Lucien's gaze toward the correspondence. "Perhaps generations. But I have eternity to demonstrate that their mother chose strength rather than surrendering to weakness." A knock at their chamber door interrupted the quiet moment. Catherine entered with her usual efficient grace, carrying documents that Eleanor recognized as the day's diplomatic correspondence. Her role as primary negotiator between vampire and mortal interests had proven both challenging and deeply satisfying, allowing her to use political skills honed over decades while serving causes that transcended mere survival. "The Asterian delegation arrives tomorrow," Catherine reported, setting the papers on Eleanor's desk with careful organization. "King Edward sends his personal representative to formalize the trade agreements we discussed." Eleanor felt a familiar satisfaction at the news. The same crown that had sent her to Ravenshollow as expendable tool now sought her expertise as irreplaceable diplomatic resource. The irony was not lost on her, though she had learned to view it with amusement rather than bitterness. "And the southern provinces?" she asked, reviewing reports from territories still adjusting to the reality of vampire-mortal cooperation. "3 more lords have requested consideration for protective alliances. Your success here has generated interest throughout the region," Catherine replied with obvious approval. "They have seen what partnership can achieve when built on mutual respect rather than exploitation." Lucien moved to the window, overlooking their thriving community, his expression holding the quiet pride. Eleanor had learned to associate with his moments of deepest satisfaction. "We have built something worth preserving," he said simply. Eleanor joined him, their reflection visible in the glass that showed vampire, lord and lady surveying domain that represented everything they had fought to protect and create. Behind them, Catherine's presence completed the triangle of partnership that had proved stronger than ancient enmity or political manipulation. "More than preserved," Eleanor corrected, thinking of the future stretching ahead with possibilities that still amazed her. "We have built something capable of growth, of adaptation, of inspiring others to choose connection over isolation." Through their enhanced senses, all 3 vampires could perceive the rhythms of life continuing around them, mortal hearts beating in peaceful sleep, vampire guards maintaining watch with gentle vigilance, children growing toward futures that would include possibilities their grandparents could never have imagined. The keep that had once stood as isolated fortress now anchored community that served as beacon for those seeking alternatives to traditional enmity. Eleanor's hand found Lucien's, their fingers intertwining with the casual intimacy of lovers who no longer questioned their right to happiness. The wedding ring she had worn for 20 years as widow now rested in her jewelry case, replaced by nothing because vampire bonds transcended symbols that mortal law required. Their connection existed in shared purpose, mutual respect, and love that had proved strong enough to transform both participants. "What shall we accomplish in our next century together?" she asked, the question carrying anticipation rather than anxiety. Lucien's smile held promise of adventures yet to come. "Whatever we choose," he replied. "Whatever courage and love can achieve when given sufficient time to work." Eleanor Whitmore Ashford, vampire lady and architect of peace, looked out over lands that flourished under protection, that served rather than dominated, and knew that her story was just beginning.